Hi, welcome to the fourth session of our Sunday night live stream meeting. And tonight's session is on what is money. Now, we've looked at, in the previous two sessions, our topic was about work, income, and taxes. And of course, those things have to do with money, but it seemed to me a really good idea to drill into the topic on what is money, because we all take for granted that we know what money is. We use it every day. It's in our wallet, or it's our debit card or credit card or bank statements. It's all these things that we use as money, and we just take it for granted that we know what it is. But I thought it good for a moment to just maybe step back and look at what money really is. Where does it come from? What's the nature of it? So that's what we're going to drive into here today. So, what is money? Well, first of all, I'd start off by mentioning again that this information is meant for informative, educational, and entertainment purposes only, and is no way meant to be advice regarding investments, income, taxes, any of that kind of thing. I'm not an expert in these topics, and if you're looking to make decisions around these topics, I advise you to go speak to a proper authority in these areas. But I do hope you find this informative and will lead you to doing some investigation on these topics. So what is money? Well, is money paper? Is it plastic? Is it coins? Is it credit cards, debit cards? Or is money just digits that are stored in a computer somewhere? Again, we work with these topics from, again, we deal with money so often. We use it every day, whether it's the coffee that you buy at the corner shop in the morning on your way to work, or whether it is a mortgage payment or a lease. We work with it all the time, and so we think we know what it is. Of course, too, then, depending on where you live, is money US dollars? Is it Canadian dollars? Is it euros, British pounds, or some other form of money? Well, it could be all these things. A bit of a definition on what money is then. This is out of Wikipedia, of course, the most authoritarian source of information, but a good one. Money is an item or veritable record that is generally accepted as payment for goods and services and repayments of debts in a particular country or socio-economic context, or is easily converted to such a form. So maybe just to rip that down a bit, money is any item or veritable record that is generally accepted as payments for goods and services. So that's a pretty broad definition of what money is. Well, it also goes on to mention that money has three main functions. It functions as a medium of exchange. It functions as a unit of account, a way to account for value. And it's also a store of value, so that work that can be done can be stored in that value and accounted for. Well, maybe my own little definition about money. Money is anything that society determines to have value and that can be easily exchanged between one another. And that's probably just my own, kind of what this means for me. Anything that society determines to have value and that can easily be exchanged between people within that society. So what has been money in the past? Because certainly here we are, 2016, and I know when I was younger, there were much less forms of money. In fact, I'm pretty sure that I was just coming into high school when I got my first debit card, and at that time, debit cards were a fairly new thing. I remember actually having a bank book. Where the teller would take the bank book and put it in her machine, and it had a printer that would write the balance on the bank book. So I remember some of these things, and so money has certainly changed a lot. But going way back, further than that, money started off really in barter. we talked about the idea of a store of value or an exchange of values. So before there was money, there was just simply barter. And it could have been, I have a cow and I need something that to me is worth the value of a cow. So I trade my cow with someone else that is able to provide me a goods or service. Maybe I need to have a home built and I'm looking for someone to come along and help me build the home. In exchange, I'm able to offer them a cow for their services in building my home. That's just the very basic form of barter, exchanging one thing that has value to one person for another thing that has value to me. Barter. Another form of money then that came along historically was trading things like grains, or other commodities at the time. It could have been any kind of harvest that came along. And then more recently, precious metals or rare items. And all of these things have become known as commodity money, meaning money that is based on the value of a commodity, whether it be silver, gold, grain, an item like a cow. All these things that have a value within society generally, something that maintains a constant value and can be relatively predictable. Now, each of these items, of course, their value has gone up or down, and that's why societies had tended to move more towards precious metals and rare items, because their value tended to be more constant. So in that vein, for a long period of time, gold was used as money. Gold minted into coins, whether they're minted into coins, gold formed into some shape that was a constant. So there could be coins made out of gold, there could be bars made out of gold, all that kind of stuff. Something that was created into a fixed or relatively fixed form. So if gold was a good source of money, because gold as a substance is relatively rare and there wasn't an awful lot of it being added into society, so it kept its value fairly stable over time. But gold became fairly difficult then if you wanted to purchase something that was worth less than a gold piece or a gold bar, it made it a little difficult to, hack off a piece of gold. And so gold as money started to appear. The idea that you could take gold, you could deposit that gold with someone, and they could give you a note back in exchange for it. A note that said, this is how much gold is on deposit with us. And in this state, we start taking on this idea of notes or paper money. And originally it started off as really just that, a note that had written down on it how much was there. And it was also then that note had a promise to exchange it in return for the gold, or it was redeemable. You could take that note into the organization that had the gold on deposit, and you could demand your gold back in exchange for the note. This is the idea of a note being redeemable on demand. So this became the idea of a note being backed by gold and payable on demand. Now, the convertibility of gold in the US and Canada actually lasted until about 1993. It started, my research showed that it started, well, it's hard to track down when this idea started because it came in gradually, but in North America it ended around 1993 with laws in the banking acts. Now, silver has also been money. Silver, of course, was the other precious metal that was very common out there as well. Silver was more popular than gold, and so silver had less of a value in a per measurement, often an ounce. So even now, gold per ounce has a fairly valuable price. Silver per ounce is much less. And so silver was a way to almost create smaller denominations. In fact, in 1786, the Board of Treasury reported to Congress that money should be defined as a unit or dollar that contains 375 grains and 64 hundredths of a grain of silver. A dollar containing this number of grains of fine silver will be worth as much as the new Spanish dollar. Now, research at the time that I did on this showed that the Spanish dollar was very popular in the Americas at this time and effectively became the de facto dollar standard in the Americas, and the new US basically adopted that dollar as its dollar. And in this here, it was defined again as 375 grains of silver. So an object with that much silver in it became the value of a dollar. And of course, the idea then became that that much silver, or a piece of silver of that size, would equal a dollar, and that became the denomination of things. So what is money now? Well, we talked earlier about commodity money, the idea that money was based on an actual commodity: gold, silver, grain, animals. Now the money system is known as fiat money. What is fiat money? Fiat money is currency established as money by government regulation or law. In other words, fiat money is money that comes into being simply because a government or authority body says that this paper has this value. It's not necessarily backed by any object. It's not backed by anything solid. It simply has value because the government says it has value. So as I mentioned, in North America, Canadian and US dollars had been backed by gold and silver. There were actual gold and silver reserves that were held by both countries to serve as the backing for the dollars. With the fiat money system, that changed, and no longer was there going to be backing by some kind of commodity like gold or silver for the dollars. Instead, what was going to give those dollars value was that the government said that they had value. So in the United States, this was created by the Federal Reserve in 1917, by the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And that set up these new dollars that are actually Federal Reserve notes. And that became the money system. Again, a money system that was based on a law or regulation. Now, it's interesting because if you go and do a little bit of digging on this, you can actually find at treasury.gov a bit of explanation about the US money system. And it says that Federal Reserve notes are not redeemable in gold, silver, or any other commodity, and receive no backing by anything. This has been the case since 1993. The notes have no value for themselves, but for what they will buy. In other sense, because they are a legal tender, Federal Reserve notes are backed by all the goods and services of the economy. So it mentions 1933 there, and there was a transition period between 1913 and 1933 where there was some backing by gold, and we'll go over that in a second because that was basically what was known as the fractional reserve during that period. But basically, treasury.gov is saying that the money system, that the Federal Reserve notes, are really not backed by anything. They're just simply backed by the goods and services of the economy. In other words, to put that in a different form, they're backed by what the US population makes and buys. Effectively, the people. Whatever the people buy, whatever the people create, that is what is backing the money. And you may have heard the term the money system being backed by the the faith of the U.S. people, or by the government. Now, of course, I'm mentioning the U.S. money system. It is basically the same in Canada. The Canadian banking system went through a slightly different process, but it really is much the same. Well, and on that point then, how did we get here? Well, in Canada, it came by the Finance Act of 1914. In the United States, it came through the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Basically around the same time. You will notice the dates there that tie right in with World War I, because World War I had a lot to do with this situation. And it's a bit of a different topic to go down that rabbit hole. But in part of that was the money demands that World War I was putting on the countries, was putting on all the countries in the world, and demanding the resources. And as I said, there's a number of other topics in there and reasons why this happened at the same time. But this is how we started to get there, was in these two acts of law that happened in both Canada and the US. Well, again, in that transition, I mentioned there was a transition from 1913 to 1933. And I talked about fractional reserve banking. So just a bit of a definition here. Fractional reserve banking is the practice whereby a bank accepts deposits, makes loans or investments, and holds reserves that are a fraction of its deposit liabilities. Reserves are held at the bank as currency or as deposits in the bank's accounts at the central bank. Fractional reserve banking is the current form of banking in most countries around the world. Here's basically what it means. I mentioned earlier that you could, or a person back some time ago could deposit gold. They could take gold to a bank or an institution, and in exchange for that gold, they would receive a note that said that the note was redeemable on demand for that gold or silver. And it was really a one-to-one transaction. I put my gold in, I get my gold out. And the amount of notes that the bank or the institution could make was based on a one-to-one relationship with that gold or silver. Fractional reserve changed that and basically meant that the bank could write more notes than the reserves, the commodity reserves that it had on hand. So just to take that, if instead of a 1-to-1 ratio, it may have changed to a place of a 2-to-1 ratio. So that, let's say that for every $1,000 of gold that was put on deposit, notes could be written for $2,000 worth. And then that fraction began to increase. And this was a way of adding more money into the system. It was also done on the basis of an understanding that nobody was going to come at the same time and demand all their gold. That not everyone was going to demand that the gold or silver be redeemed all at the same time. So if that was the case, if it was never going to happen that everyone was going to come in, then the bank was safe by writing more notes on the deposits because they'd never be caught effectively with a situation where they couldn't redeem the gold or silver or the precious metals that they had on deposit. Of course, sometimes this did end up happening, and that was often known as a run on the bank, a time or a place where people went to the bank to get their gold or silver, or in later days, they've gone to the bank to get their cash out of the bank. That's the nature of a fractional reserve system. Now, since then, gold, silver, and these other commodities haven't been quite as popular in terms of banks having things on reserve. In fact, my understanding and my research shows that many banks, many central banks around the world, including the Bank of Canada, now has virtually no commodities in their reserve. In fact, what they have on reserve is US dollars. In other words, they have somebody else's money on reserve to back their banks. And so, again, this idea of a run on the banks is that nobody's going to come and show up at the bank to demand all their money or whatever that thing is that's backing up the money source of a given country. Now, over time, this fractional system has become more and more to the place where the banks are now able to create a whole lot more. Like the fraction is very small now. And I'd encourage you to do your own little bit of research if you're into that, interested in that area, to drill into just kind of what the fraction is going on. When I did my research, I really couldn't get a handle on that there is really any stated amount of reserves that a bank needs. It seems to really just now be down to the market forces where the markets and the currency traders now look at a given country and look at how much reserve they have and then vote based on purchasing the demand for that currency as to their feeling of the value for that. That's kind of a sense of how we got there, or got here, as it were. So how is it now that there's so many forms of money? Well, because again, we started off talking about these different forms of money. And now we have, of course, cash. And as I mentioned, when I was younger, cash was the main form that I was familiar with. Whatever you bought in cash. If you wanted to go to McDonald's and buy something, you bought it in cash. Well, now it's very common to buy something at whatever store it is on debit. A debit card, being able to take money directly out of your account. And of course, this is all done, facilitated through computerized banking and a whole computer system in the background that's handling all of these exchanges. So it could be a debit card that is giving access to the money. Of course, a credit card is the flip side of that, creating a debt that you're going to pay off later. And of course, you might pay that off through an online banking transaction where you are making a transfer from your bank account to someone else's bank account. But of course, all these things are happening digitally. And that bank statement that you may get in the mail once a month, or maybe you don't even get it in the mail anymore, maybe you just get it online as a record of debits and credits. How is that money? I mean, the truth is, when you look into how much money is actually in paper versus how much money is simply in digits, there is much more money in digits now than there is in actual paper. In fact, the whole idea of notes, the whole idea of paper being a note has morphed into this idea where you don't even have to have a note necessarily in terms of that paper that you might have, but an institution may have created a note and they put that on file with a company that has millions or billions or trillions of dollars attached to it. And that then being deposited into a bank, that gets into the currency money pool, and that becomes those dollars that end up being in bank accounts. Of course, there's also coinage as well. In Canada, we have a $1 and $2 coin, and of course, it's understood that the coin itself, of course, at one point in time, the coin, a gold coin or a silver coin, actually had, as we looked at, the value of silver in it, that it actually had the value intrinsically in the commodity in that coin. A Canadian dollar or a Canadian, what we call them, a loonie or toonie, even though they're coins, or whether it be a 25-cent coin or whatever the denomination of that coin, it's generally understood that that coin does not have that commodity value in it, that the commodity in the coin is simply just a representation, again, of the value of the fiat money. So what's next for money? Because, again, going through a little bit of this history, what's next for money? Well, if you've been watching the news, there has been much going on with the money system since 2008. The bailouts that happened all around the world, the money situations in Greece, there is a lot going on with money. And from my understanding, this whole fractional reserve system, this system that was created in 1913 and continues to accelerate into our time now, is a system that some feel is unsustainable, that some feel is a system that cannot go on forever. Quite frankly, I don't know what the future for money is. It's not necessarily my area of expertise. What I do know is that there's lots of people out there that are experts, and I'd encourage you to go out and do some reading for yourself. Because money being something that we use every day, we use it without thinking about it. And we use it in a way that we have faith and belief in that money. We believe that in our bank accounts there's a certain amount of value there. And we believe that it is going to be there to meet our needs as we're going to need it. But if you talk to some people in Greece that went through their situation where the banks were shut down for a long period of time because the Greece banks basically went bankrupt. Whether it's them or whether there's other countries around the world that have had banking issues and their money became basically worthless, you'll discover that in those moments that understanding money and understanding the value of money and where it is and how it works became really important to their lives. It had real effect on their lives. We haven't experienced this yet, and yet it's good to understand how this could potentially play out. Do some education, gain some wisdom, so that you're in a good place should this money system that has been rolling now for about 100 years, if it should have a real hiccup. So I'd encourage you to look into that. A place that has some good information, Dr. Stephen Jones writes about this at God's Kingdom Ministries. If you just do a Google search for God's Kingdom Ministries, you can find some good information there. Another source, Servius.org, Servius Ministries. Those are two that I'm aware of that have some good information and certainly also back it up and look at it from a biblical and prophetic perspective. And of course, there's lots of other sources out there as well, so do your research. And I'll leave you with that for today.